thank you all. Our webinar today is AI Startups and the Law, Legal Considerations for Tech Founders. I'm Eric Engineer. I'm a partner at S3 Ventures. We're the largest venture capital firm focused on Texas-based startups. We invest in a lot of technology startups, and some of them are AI-focused companies, but nearly all of them are utilizing AI technologies in some way or another, or exploring ways that they might in the future, whether that's within their products or within their daily operations. And so it's an incredibly exciting and dynamic time for startup founders, but it's also filled with a lot of uncertainty and confusion around this topic. And a lot of that uncertainty relates back to how these new technologies intersect with current interpretations of the law. And in fact, if you've been reading the news, you've probably seen several lawsuits that have started to pop up with this latest wave of AI around generative technologies as they are coming to market. And so to better kind of understand this legal landscape, we invited two experts on the subject from two of the country's leading firms. We have Scott McKinney from Wilson Sonsini and Justin Haan from Morrison Foerster. So thank you both for joining me here today. You guys, I know, are deep in all of this, and we're really fortunate to have you for the hour to be able to kind of educate us on this important topic. In terms of an agenda, we're going to start by getting to know each other. I'm going to have Scott and Justin introduce themselves, but we're also going to do a couple of those polls that I mentioned so we get to know who's in the audience. It looks like we're almost close to 100 attendees here, so I'm excited to see that. And then Scott's going to just kind of do a little of kind of a primer on the basics of AI, ML, and generative AI, just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. We're going to be using some terminology here and there, and want to make sure everyone kind of understands what we're talking about. And then we'll really get into the meat of things, the legal considerations in three main areas: training data, input prompts, and the generated content, because each of them have different dynamics to them as it relates to the law. And then Scott and Justin have seen a lot of companies, maybe in some cases, make mistakes. And so there's some best practices that have been developed over the years that they will also share. And like I mentioned earlier, we will also save hopefully 10 minutes at the end purely for Q&A. All right, so let's jump into it. Scott, Justin, I'll let each of you kind of just give a little bit of background on who you are and kind of your experience in this space. Scott, would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks, Eric. And it's great to be here today. So my name is Scott McKinney. I'm a partner in Wilson Sonsini's Technology Transactions Group. I focus my practice on new and emerging technologies, and as part of that, artificial intelligence and machine learning has been a big part of my practice for quite some time, since well before the recent generative AI boom. I started and co-lead Wilson Sonsini's AI practice globally, and I teach a class at Georgetown Law on AI technology startups, and I teach a class at Columbia Law on frontier technologies like AI, robotics, blockchain, and the metaverse. It's good to be here today.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, likewise, great to be here today. I'm Justin Haan. I'm a partner in the Technology Transactions Group in San Francisco of Morrison Foerster. And much like Scott, work with a variety of companies, both big and small, with their, on their cutting edge technological needs and their contracting around that in particular. And yes, like Scott, we've also been working on these AI technologies for the before times, by which I mean sort of before the launch of ChatGPT, when suddenly everything was about AI and everyone had this, rush towards AI. And yeah, so really looking forward to working with you today.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Scott. So we're going to start with some polls just to hear who's in the audience. So I'm going to start one of these. So just give me a second. And each of you should see a little window pop up through Zoom with these questions. And so if you wouldn't mind answering it, will help us understand who's in the audience. The question is, which best describes you: founder, CEO of tech startup, or you work at a tech company, or you work at a non-tech company. You might be an investor, a lawyer, or service provider, or other. So those are the options. I'm going to wait a couple more seconds. Looks like we're at about 80% participation here. So thank you, those who are answering. And I think that's probably good enough. So I'm going to end the poll now. and we can all see the results, hopefully. And it looks like we have about 31% of the folks in the audience are founders, CEOs of tech companies. Great, that's pretty much our target audience here. We really wanted to educate that group. We have others who work at tech companies, a few that are not tech companies, a fair number of investors, lawyers. All right, Scott, Justin, you better be ready with your answers there. You'll have some lawyers in the room and some service providers as well. So thank you all for doing that. That really helps us kind of craft what we talk about today. The next question, I'm going to advance here, give me a second, is going to be about your experience with AI. And so how experienced is your business with AI? Very experienced means you're using AI in several ways across the company for multiple years. Experienced, you're using it in a limited fashion for multiple years. Limited experience, you've operationalized AI before this year, or you might just be getting started. So you're just starting to really kind of put it into production. Others might be testing, experimenting, but have not operationalized. Or you're planning, you haven't done anything, but you hope to do it within the year. Or you have no plans, you're just here to listen, but not going to do anything with it. All right, we got 75%, 80% participation. That's probably good enough. I'm going to end the poll, share it with you all. And as you can see here, it looks like good 20% are getting started, but we have a few people that are very experienced or limited experience. So it looks like most people are actually doing things, which is really interesting and exciting to see here. And not unexpected given what we've all been reading about in terms of the adoption of AI broadly. All right, our third question here. How is your business using AI? So I'm going to start that poll now. And we're really kind of thinking of it in a few buckets. You're building proprietary AI technologies within your products and services. So these are things that you're actually building yourself using kind of more foundational AI technologies. Versus the second one, you're embedding third-party technologies within your products or services. So you're probably procuring it. You don't have AI experts in-house, but you're using it, leveraging maybe APIs or other things in some ways. Or you might be using AI native tools to accelerate your work. It could be your operations. You might be using ChatGPT. Your developers might be using GitHub Copilot. Your marketing folks might be using Stable Diffusion to generate images. The fourth option is using AI-driven features that are embedded in existing products. If you're a fan of Notion, you know they have an AI feature. Microsoft Office Suite is starting to add some of that. Or none of the above. You haven't really touched it in any way. All right, I'm going to wait a couple more seconds here as people decode what those options mean. And this is multiple choice, so feel free to select multiple ones if more than one hold true. All right, we got about 70% participation. I'm going to share the results. All right, interesting. So a quarter of the folks are actually building proprietary AI technologies into the product. Another third are using third-party. 2/3 are using tools to accelerate work. That's really interesting. That's consistent with what I've been seeing in our portfolio as well. And then, yeah, as more of these features become mainstream, I think we'll see that number of 27% go up. All right, so thank you all for that. We're going to now move on to our little primer. Like I said, Scott, why don't you kind of walk us through kind of some of the basics of AI, ML, and generative AI?
Great. So, to set the scene for discussing the legal and commercial and other issues associated with AI and machine learning and generative AI, it's actually necessary, I think, to understand, at least at a very, very basic, but very, very high level, what this stuff is and how it works, because how it works plays into the risks and commercial and legal considerations that you should think about when you're using or developing or leveraging AI in some way. So we're going to do a very, very quick 5 to 10 minutes overview of AI, machine learning, and generative AI. This section alone could be its own 2 or 3 hour presentation, but we're going to do the 5-minute version. Or I'm going to attempt to do that here. So what is artificial intelligence? The thing I like to emphasize here is that there's no one agreed upon definition. And, several years ago, I was speaking at an AI conference, and I was, it was a panel discussion, and the topic of the panel was define artificial intelligence. And, I had a definition, the 3 other panelists had a definition. Their definitions were very different than mine. Then we opened it up to the audience, which is full of, AI experts and AI engineers. We got about 30 other definitions, and everyone disagreed, and everyone had a different definition. And I share that anecdote to emphasize that, when people say AI, it can mean many different things. Something that may have been considered artificial intelligence back in the 1950s or 1960s may not be considered AI today. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because, again, the type of AI and how it works, the data that it uses, how it interoperates with your system or other customer systems, etc., matters for understanding the legal risks and the commercial risks associated with AI. So, there are these broad categories of AI: reactive, limited memory, theory of mind, and self-aware. Those aren't really that important to know or memorize for our purposes. Just know that we're at limited memory at this point. We have not made it to theory of mind or self-aware yet. I think that there's a few folks that have made the news that would argue we have made it to theory of mind, but I think that's largely been debunked. So again, the takeaway is, if someone says we have AI or we're using AI, there's a question to be asked. It's like, what is it? How does it work? Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so you've probably heard the term machine learning. A lot of modern AI and artificial intelligence that has made the news recently is machine learning, or falls into a category of AI called machine learning. And so here on the left, you see that there's all these different things that some people might consider AI, and machine learning is just a subset of that. Machine learning is a very powerful technology, and it also helps power generative AI. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how it works. So traditionally, if I was going to write a computer program, I would write a program, I would test it out, I would see how it works, and then I would notice some bugs and some ways that I could improve it. And then I would go in as a human and I would change the program, modify it, improve it, fix the bugs, etc. Machine learning allows us, in a way, to automate that process. And I'm simplifying things greatly for purposes of this presentation. But let me try to give some examples. So self-driving cars. We have this incredible technology that's been developed over the last 10 years that allows cars to drive along the highway largely without crashing, and even act as taxi services that are functional. I think where Justin lives in San Francisco today. How was the software developed for self-driving cars? It was not developed solely by the traditional method of people going in and writing some code to tell a car how to drive along the road, and then fixing that code and tweaking it. Instead, these innovative technology companies drove cars along the road with sensors that took in a tremendous amount of data about the road. Did the car go over the line? What is the LiDAR information that's coming in, etc. That data was fed into an algorithm, and the algorithm learned from the data. It learned, for example, okay, the car drives straight during regular conditions, but when it's dark or rainy, we're crossing the line a little bit. So we're going to take that information from miles and miles and miles of driving along the road, and improve and learn automatically without having to sort of manually go in and change the software. And so that is how primarily self-driving cars have developed. That's also how Netflix knows, what show you want to watch next, right? It has taken in a tremendous amount of input data based on millions of people watching shows that might like the same types of shows that you like, and it uses that data to teach its algorithm that because you watched, The Bachelor, then you're probably going to want to watch, the Bachelorette. That's a probably a bad example because that's obvious, but you get the point. That it is not humans in there looking at your data and tweaking an algorithm with code. It is software that is being fed a huge amount of information and then automatically improving itself with that information. This is an extremely powerful tool, and this is, the main driver of generative AI, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There are two categories of machine learning. There's supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is, is a type of machine learning where, the input data that we use to train the algorithm is carefully selected and sometimes labeled. So, if I was going to train a Netflix algorithm, I might take a carefully selected data set and input it into the algorithm intentionally because I have identified some way in which I want to improve the algorithm. So that is different than unsupervised learning, where unsupervised learning, basically we unleash the algorithm on a huge amount of data and it will identify patterns or other things that may not be there. So this is used a lot like in the biotech industry and drug discovery, right? We have a huge amount of genomic and other type of data that we can analyze, and machines can identify things that scientists and doctors would never have done themselves. That is a very high level overview, but hopefully it's informative for our discussion of generative AI, which we're going to turn to now. Okay, so generative AI, which is all the rage right now, is a type of artificial intelligence that is based on machine learning. How does it work? So at a very high level, algorithms are fed a tremendous amount of data, and then those algorithms learn from that data and improve over time, and then eventually become good enough that they are able to generate content in a way that is what we would expect as humans. So, for example, ChatGPT or some of the more prominent chatbot generative AI tools out there, they were trained, the data that was input into their machine learning technology was essentially all of the text on the internet, which is a huge amount of data. And it wasn't quite all the text, but the way that ChatGPT learned to be able to respond in ways that are amazing, and that gave it the ability to generate this thing here in the middle, where I asked ChatGPT, what are the key legal issues in generative AI? And it output these 7 things in about 5 seconds, which are actually quite good. They're not perfect, they're not complete, but it's a good start. The way that ChatGPT was able to learn to do that was by repetition and a huge amount of data and a huge amount of compute power over time, constantly improving the algorithm by being fed data. The interesting thing about ChatGPT and generative AI tools is, they are not developed solely based on sort of automated means, right? We don't just unleash the algorithm on all the content of the internet, and then 6 months later we have ChatGPT and it's perfect. Or 6 months later we have Stable Diffusion and it creates these amazing images here on the right side of the screen. There's actually a human element as well. So there are humans that go in and look at results and say, that does seem like a result that a human would expect based on this prompt, or that doesn't seem like a result that's good. And that's part of the training as well. So it's for generative AI, it's really a combination of that automated machine learning together with reinforcement learning, which is human-based input. If you have not played around with generative AI, I encourage you to do so. Justin and I have given lots of talks on this topic over the last year or so, and there's a version of this talk where we can just spend the whole hour giving cool examples of stuff that's generated by generative AI. We're going to skip over that, and I encourage you to, if you haven't played around with ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion or DALL-E or one of these amazing tools, go do it after the session.
Yeah, I'll give a small plug for if you have young kids, using DALL-E with them to come up with fantastical creations, quite easily for someone like me who's not artistic. It's a great idea, and you're also training them to be future prompt engineers, which may be a useful skill for the future.
I'm going to take note of that for my sons. They'll love it.
Right. Okay, so generative AI, it's not just some software. It's software and this, really highly sophisticated technology stack here on the right. So in order to develop these large language models like GPT-3, it requires, a tremendous amount of cloud hosting, a tremendous amount of GPUs of compute, and which all require a tremendous amount of power and a tremendous amount of money. So it is not, a lot of the most prominent examples of generative AI that you've all heard of have required, more than just some software. It's software plus these very sophisticated GPUs or TPUs that are required to develop these amazing technologies. Here on the left, I want to point out, so just to get the terminology right. So if we're developing generative AI, we have training data. So that's all the text of the internet or all of the images on the internet. We input that data into an algorithm or the model. And over time, we develop the foundation model, which might be ChatGPT, GPT-3, something like that. So now that's if we're ChatGPT or Anthropic or Stable Diffusion or DALL-E, one of these companies that's actually developing from the ground up their own foundational large language model. If you're a generative AI user, there's input data. So that's, me writing, paint me a picture of a dragon fighting a princess, to entertain my kids. I input that into a prompt. It goes into the foundation model, which has been trained by, this diagram above, and output is, some content, like a picture of a dragon or a story or an outline of all of the key legal issues associated with the use of generative AI. Okay, that is a very high-level overview, but I hope that helps set the stage for the rest of the discussion, where we're going to get into the interesting legal and commercial considerations associated with AI and generative AI.
Thanks, Scott. Yep. So we're going to go now to that next section here, and like I said earlier, we're really going to split it up into 3 groups. First, we're going to talk about training data and all the implications around that. Then input prompts, and then the generated content itself. So let's start with the training data, and maybe Justin, if you want to maybe jump in here a little bit and just talk a little bit about the kind of the different sources, the IP and the regulation associated with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So training data is really, a direct concern, based on our polling, it would be most directly of concern to those of you who are kind of creating your own generative AI models. If you're just merely kind of a user of something like ChatGPT, it's useful for you to know where the training data comes from, but ultimately, and it may impact, I suppose, your selection of which tool to use, but ultimately, it's not something you have a lot of control over. I think, the one area where the lines blur a bit is if you are in that use case where you are, embedding something like GPT-4 into your own products. You may have the ability to fine tune that model or other models offered by providers of these, generative AI models. And that fine tuning process may involve the, use of your own sort of fine tuning training data, you could call it. So in that instance, some of these considerations would apply. So as was previously noted, things like, ChatGPT, which, became, this viral sensation, if you will, is trained on a variety of databases and some, as noted, is sort of largely, you could describe it as having, ingested the entirety of the web. So in that way, the data is from a public source, not a proprietary source. And much of that, there's a couple of different ways you can harvest that information, you could say. So one is through a process called scraping, and that has a variety of considerations that go into it that, if undertaking scraping, it needs to be done in a manner that complies with applicable law. So there are concerns around, you could be breaching, you could be, liable for breach of contract claim if you clicked to accept the terms of service of a website and later in those terms prohibited you from scraping, and you did so anyway. That would be a potential source of liability. Another is called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and that prohibits, exceeding your authority, when accessing a website. So there are some risks associated with scraping. It's a bit of a gradation, and we regularly, help clients sort of put in place policies that, are designed to mitigate that risk. Probably the least risk approach is to use one of these databases that is already existing. Something like Common Crawl, for example, is a database that's been compiled by researchers I believe in Germany, nonprofit, and it basically already has a huge corpus of scraped data. So you don't need to undertake the scraping yourself, which can help avoid some of these sources of liability. But as the next bullet will suggest, with IP and copyright, with copyright in particular, that that potential risk does not go away merely by using something like a Common Crawl or a database that you otherwise get from someone else. I guess to take a step back, the most risk-free manner would be to use some sort of proprietary database where you are taking a license from someone, and we've helped some clients do that from time to time. So for example, OpenAI took a license from the Associated Press to use all of their their records going back to like 1985, their history of all of their articles to be able to train on, and that was a transaction that we assisted with. So that's obviously the gold standard in terms of risk mitigation. But the next would probably be to use something that's already been scraped by someone else so that you don't have to engage in the scraping. And it's also more cost effective to not have to do the scraping yourself.
Yeah. And just to jump in, just to share an anecdote, a common mistake or common misunderstanding that we hear a lot from clients, even very sophisticated clients, is they got some data or they got a bunch of pictures or they got some videos, and I asked them, well, where did you get those? And it was like, oh, it was free. Got it on the internet. Like, just because something is on the internet and you can download it freely does not mean it is free to use, and that is a common mistake. And so there is some risk, which Justin's about to go into, with just taking images or content or data from anywhere without permission, because some of that stuff is free to use and it's fine. Some of it is subject to copyright, and some of it is subject to terms of service and terms of use that say you can do certain things, but you can't do other things. So it's you're developing an LLM, you need to be careful about where you get your data.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you for that. Another interesting kind of piece of the scraping discussion is the role that robots.txt plays, and that's an exclusion standard that many websites, if you type in, newyorktimes.com or any website and put in the slash, and then you type robots.txt, you can actually read the file where they have it's a request not to be, or it allows the website operator to request not to be scraped by certain types of bots, or only to be scraped within certain folders in the hierarchy. And so compliance with that would also be, a best practice when engaging in scraping. But let's assume that you've got, some source of data and you've got it, for free online somewhere. As Scott noted, it very well may be, and is in fact most likely protected by someone's copyright, some third-party copyright. Now, when developing one of these AI models, the developers of these tools inherently, engaging in the training requires the making of some copies. Copies are made in the course of that training. And copying, as the word copyright would suggest, is one of the exclusive rights that a copyright holder has. So the big question out there today in the law is whether or not that training, or under what circumstances that practice of taking someone else's third-party copyrighted work and training a model based on it, to what extent is that copyright infringement, or perhaps to what extent is it covered by a doctrine known as the fair use doctrine, which permits individuals or entities to engage in something that might otherwise be infringement, but in particular enables that, permits that if it is, there's a variety of factors, but one of the most important ones is a very transformative kind of reuse of the technology, of the training data in a way that does not sort of undercut the market for that training data, is the way to think about it. So, I think there's, and again, we're really focusing on generative AI here, but there's been a flurry of litigation in the past 9 months or so. I think it's helpful maybe for us to go backwards in time. Some of the most recent cases have been filed against companies like OpenAI, Meta, and Alphabet, kind of as you'd expect, kind of some of the big players in this space, also Microsoft. And the, OpenAI, Meta, and Alphabet in particular have been sued by authors of books who allege that their books were used as part of the training data to generate these models. So one of the kind of buzziest litigations out there is the Sarah Silverman case. So Sarah Silverman wrote a book about bedwetting, and she notes that now when asked about her, the ChatGPT will describe and summarize or provide some insight into her history of bedwetting. And so that case is, there's a variety of claims made in a case like that. Some of them may be more more attenuated than others, but I think of the real crux of those cases being around the training and whether or not that training is permissible, or whether or not it is fair use. And so that's something we're looking forward to seeing some results on, because I think many of us in the industry would love, hoping it goes the right way, would love some clarity on that point, because that is one of the big unknowns. And so that's a text-based infringement claim, where you have some text-to-text AI model. Another common model, as we discussed earlier, something like DALL-E 2. There are also companies, Stability AI makes Stable Diffusion. Midjourney has an image generation model. And those image generation models were also the subject of a couple of different litigations against Stability and Midjourney, alleging that the training on a vast source of photos online that are totally available. Anyone can get them on, just by clicking to the right sites. But by training on those, these companies are alleging that the outputs and that, that training basically infringed their copyrights, and therefore they should not be permitted to sell this model. Some interesting wrinkles in that case are, in the Getty case, for example, the Getty noted there in their filing with the court that the many of the images that come out of that model, or at least some of them, appear to have something resembling the Getty Images watermark on the photos. So there's also, a trademark claim perhaps embedded there. But it doesn't actually say Getty Images. It's kind of a scramble of letters. But, that was not something, to Scott's point earlier, that anyone coded in or suggested. That's really an artifact of the fact that this model has learned, you could say, that, high quality images often have this little logo thing, a third of the way up on the right side, and they've duplicated that without knowing that it, why that's there. There's another set of IP issues regarding outputs that we'll discuss in coming slides. And then the final piece is just around the regulation. Privacy and bias are big concerns around training data. So you've seen regulators have concerns around the use of personal information as training data. You can imagine when you're scraping the web, you're getting a bunch of personal information, things like people's names, addresses, other just identifying information. And in California here we have the CCPA. I think it's the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's been a while since I've said that. But also the other well-known privacy regulation in Europe is the GDPR. And many of those same regulators, particularly in Europe, that were handling privacy regulation, are also now looking at regulation of AI in a variety of different respects, including standalone legislation like the AI Act, but also just concerns around whether people's personal information is being ingested into these models and even worse, perhaps, output by the models.
Yeah, and just to jump in there, I think, some takeaways on the regulation front. In the U.S., there isn't just one AI regulation. It's really a smorgasbord of various regulations, including privacy laws and the FTC, and state attorney generals and other regulatory bodies that have been regulating AI recently. And again, back to our discussion of how machine learning works, it works by using and ingesting and doing things with a tremendous amount of data. So if there is personal information or sensitive information in that data, that could trigger privacy laws. A separate issue is that, remember how generative AI works. It is trained on data that is out there in the universe, out there in the internet. Sometimes the content on the internet is bad or biased, or sometimes even factual information reflects facts of society that we don't like. And what that can do is result in the algorithm that has been trained on that data that is bad or biased, or reflects things that we don't like, results in a biased outcome. So, for example, discriminating against folks if you're using AI as an algorithm to determine if someone gets a loan or gets a house, or something like that. So there are interesting regulations on that front. I'll just say, without getting really into the weeds on all of that, is how you use AI matters. And if you're using it for something like making health decisions or getting loans or housing or anything like that, there's heightened scrutiny, and you need to be really careful and be thoughtful about how you deploy the AI.
Scott, Justin, we have a couple of questions coming in here that I think might be relevant. One has to do with, when you have anonymized data through your own application, maybe from your customers or your users, and things you may want to think about there if you're training models off of that. And a related question is synthetic data. And if you're creating your own data in some way, and how does that fit into a legal framework, if at all, if it's covered?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take maybe the first one, which is the question of, under what circumstances could you, if you're the service provider, use the anonymized data of your customers to further, basically develop new models of your own? Generally, the rule of the road would be to, very clearly disclose that to your customers, to make sure you have that their consent to do that. because depending upon the nature of how things are allocated, that data may be owned by the customer, and it may therefore be, for example, subject to copyright or subject to confidentiality obligations that you have to that customer. And those confidentiality obligations can be more than just non-disclosure, which we often think of in the confidentiality context, but there's also often a non-use or a restriction on use of that data. And it's not uncommon, if you have an NDA, on their paper, for example, for that NDA to say you will only use the data for the purpose of providing the services to that customer. And so that would appear to preclude, in many instances, your ability to use that data for the additional purpose of training and improving your model, if you're going to make that model available to all of your customers. So I think the first rule would be to make sure you're getting the appropriate consents. There's different sort of gradations, that you'll see in the market in terms of how transparent companies are about what they mean when they say improving the product. There's often a pretty big difference commercially between using someone's data to create something like a classifier model, which is really just used to maybe identify, is that a cat or is it not a cat, versus a generative AI model, which I think tends to rub people a bit, causes more concern among customers that their data is going to be used for the benefit of others, and maybe in fact there's concerns often about it being regurgitated to the end user of some new model in the future.
Yeah, and I guess I'll take a stab at the second question about synthetic data. So yes, synthetic data is, it's basically an artificial version of data that's typically based on real data. So you have a real data set, and then you create a synthetic version of that data to help to train your model. And this can have certain advantages because the synthetic data can sort of fill in gaps that were in your data set, make the data sort of ready or more tuned and more apt for training. And it has the benefit typically of being anonymized and not including sort of sensitive and personal information and other stuff that could trigger the contractual consent issues that Justin was mentioning, as well as like the privacy consent issues and other things that might be associated with using data that includes payment information or personal information or health information, etc. So essentially, the short answer is using synthetic data is a growing practice, and I do see it a lot in like the health tech industry or fintech, for example, industries where we're dealing with a lot of sensitive information, because it allows companies to sort of mitigate or get around some of the potential issues associated with using regulated data in the training of their models.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna keep us moving here. We are way behind schedule. So these next few topics, we may have to go a little quicker. But that was all great discussion. Thank you. The next topic really was input prompts. So you want to jump in there really quick, Justin?
Yeah, sure thing. So previously we discussed training, which is an issue maybe mostly for developers. Input prompts, by contrast, are probably biggest concern is from the user perspective. So especially if you run an enterprise, there's a lot of concern, and we're advising lots of companies around what does it mean if my employees are using ChatGPT, for example. And there really the risks are about the fact that many of these tools are made available without a confidentiality commitment by the vendor, at least as made available to consumers. The big takeaway that I would say is that we often counsel clients who want to use these tools, because they are quite powerful, and it's hard to turn your back to them and say, no, just don't use these. We'll pretend like, bury our heads in the sand and pretend like November of 2022 never happened. Instead, we really advise clients to procure, enterprise grade versions of these tools that contain robust confidentiality protections, commitments around personal information, commitments around data security, and the like. It isn't obviously ever risk-free when you're submitting your data to a third party, cloud-hosted service provider, but it's much lower risk than having your employees just enter data on their own personal accounts, to these service providers. And so, the types of risks that come out here are, that your company could be inputting some, individuals at your company could be inputting some trade secrets into the model that might not be subject to confidentiality protections. They could be putting, attorney-client privileged information if you're a lawyer, other material non-public information if you're a public company or looking to go public. You might have some third parties' data that you're obligated to keep confidential that you would maybe be in breach of by uploading it to one of these or inputting it to one of these services. And also, regulated data like personal information or health data under HIPAA. And so on the right are just some examples of the types of questions that as a user you should ask when selecting selecting among the different types of models that you might use. We can probably go to the next slide.
There was one question about this, so I'll just ask it here. It says, in the LLM world, who owns the model when you share data through prompts or fine tuning with the vendor? What do you need to disclose to your customers? All of that stuff.
Yeah, so I think as we discussed before, you should always disclose to your customers that you are, using their data to train on your models. So that includes if you're using it as an input to some other model or to fine tune another model. And generally with companies like, vendors of AI tools like OpenAI, they retain ownership of the models, including fine-tuned versions of models. You can think of fine-tuned versions as just kind of forked versions of a base model that may be sort of refined to do a more specific task. So I think the industry standard there is that the model remains held by the vendor, but oftentimes there will be something like an exclusivity commitment that basically says, I'm not going to let anyone else use your fine-tuned version of the model. That's just for you, customer. And so that usually is adequate for most use cases.
Great, thank you. All right, the last topic here was generated content. And so that's the output of these models. Who wants to go take the first stab at that?
Yeah, I can take it really quick on that and then turn it over to Scott maybe to talk about hallucinations. Yeah, there's fascinating questions about the output of generated AI models. Well, first of all, there's the question or risk that maybe the output that you've received now is actually a regurgitation of something that existed in the training data. And that is kind of the crux of this case that's been filed as a class action against Microsoft for their Copilot coding solution, which is powered by OpenAI's Codex tool or model rather. And the claim there is actually not an infringement claim, but the claim is that when Microsoft and OpenAI return some of that code, it no longer sort of states or identifies the source of that information. It doesn't say that this came from this repository from this user. I think that that concern, which you'll see referenced a bunch, I think that that's going to be solved technologically in a variety of ways. You see companies like Microsoft and OpenAI now implement filters that'll actually allow the user to say, please run a check against, confirm that the output does not sort of match nearly verbatim to some input in your training data set. And if it does, don't surface it, or some newer future iterations will actually maybe identify for you the source so you can give the proper attribution. But I think, of the different types of copyright concerns, those I think of as, less likely to be an ongoing, concern. And I should say, yeah. And the other kind of more interesting part, though, is that the Copyright Office has held that works generated using a generative AI tool cannot be the subject of copyright protection. So just to quickly parse that a bit, there have been a couple of cases by the name of some guy named Thaler, who's really tried to have just purely machine generated images, for example, where literally it somehow is just the machine itself is kind of coming up with some image without even an input. And he's sought to actually have the machine get some recognition as the inventor of a patent or the author of a copyright. And courts have pretty much unanimously said, no, machines aren't humans. They can't be authors and they can't be inventors. The more interesting question, though, is even if you are a human that's putting in detailed inputs to a generative AI tool and getting an output, the Copyright Office has taken the position for now that you cannot get a copyright in that work. Now, we may see this evolve, and in fact, we are representing Chris Castanova, who's an author of a comic book series who used generative AI to make their the images using Midjourney, and they were rejected. Their copyright registration was actually revoked once it came out that they were using generative AI tools. But we're representing her in filing a new, more complex filing that shows a lot more detail in terms of the level of inputs used to generate the outputs. So we're testing the waters on that in terms of seeing whether the Copyright Office will move. The big consideration there for most people, though, comes up, for example, in this code generation space. If you start to write a bunch of proprietary code for your proprietary code base, and large chunks of that code may no longer be copyrightable. So that becomes a concern if you intend to make some of this stuff available, a source code disclosed model like an open source model. You may not have the ability to actually control what people do with it, at least not using copyright.
Right. Yeah. And just to reiterate, yeah, machines that create copyrightable material, it is not copyrightable. And if a machine invents something, it is not patentable. So that has implications for all types of things, including, sometimes companies will make reps and warranties in their contracts saying, like, I own all rights in the software, or I have all rights in the IP. And those reps and warranties, which have probably been standard or relatively boilerplate in most agreements, may have to be reconsidered in the context of a company that uses generative AI to develop code or content or invent things. So quickly on hallucinations, hopefully everyone's aware of this now. Back in like February, March, April, this was more news when we were giving these types of talks. But generative AI is this very powerful tool. It creates amazing results. It's really actually incredible. And it is so amazing and so incredible that it's easy to lull you into a false sense of security that the results are correct or complete or error-free. And we know that the results of generative AI are not necessarily correct or complete or error-free. And in fact, sometimes the output is completely made up. There have been instances of, generative AI just making up fake news reports about people having committed crimes and linking to articles in the Washington Post, which never existed. And then these people being defamed by this made up thing. Generative AI has been used by lawyers in court cases in a pretty public situation, and someone used ChatGPT for legal research, and it just made up 6 cases that looked really realistic with realistic sites, and the lawyer submitted that to the courts and got really embarrassed. But the point here is that it is a mistake to assume that everything that comes out of generative AI, whether it's code or an answer to a question, is correct or complete or error-free. And that includes in the software context. Remember, how is this technology developed and how is it trained? For example, Justin mentioned Copilot. Copilot was trained in essentially all of the code in GitHub. And all of the code in GitHub includes a lot of really good code. It also includes some code that's not so good, or might have errors, or might be incomplete. And that's what the technology was trained on. So what you get as an output might be great, or it might be code that has a data security vulnerability. It may not be updated because Copilot was trained on 2021 version of GitHub. And so what comes out might be something that looks really good, but it might have some problematic issues. It might be made up, or it might have a pretty fundamental bug. So, I know we're running out of time, so maybe to jump ahead to, some of the best practices for companies that, want to use generative AI. At a high level, if you're using generative AI internally, You just need to understand the use case of generative AI. Like, are you using it to develop, to write emails you're going to send around, advertising a Friday afternoon happy hour? Or are you using it to generate a picture that you're going to put on your website? Are you using it to develop some just test code just to let your engineers play around? Or are you using it to develop software, source code that you're incorporating into your product that you're going to distribute to customers? The risks in those different scenarios are very, very different. And your policy and the steps you take in those use cases should be different. The main thing I want to reiterate is in all of these cases, again, you cannot assume that what you get from generative AI is correct or complete, or doesn't look just like someone else's thing, such that they're going to claim that you're infringing their IP, or doesn't include a virus or a bug, or doesn't include a made-up statement that could cause you as a company to answer something correctly, or really get some egg on your face. So the best practice overall is to ensure that your employees or people within your organization understand that, and they understand the nature of how this stuff works, and implement human review and approval chains for the different use cases, so that there's someone, especially when we're talking about the riskier use cases like using generative AI to develop software or develop stuff that you're going to put on your website, that there's some human that's double checking that and saying, okay, that actually looks good. Let's put it through our regular code review process. Maybe let's scan it through viruses or open source issues, etc. Let's look at the image, and does this look like a blatant ripoff of some famous person's art, or does it look bespoke? Right? Put those types of sort of safeguards into place, and you can mitigate a lot of the potential risk associated with using generative AI.
Great. Let's jump to the last section here, which is the vendors, because there are a couple of questions that are coming in this area too, which is, if you're using these vendors that are being sued and all these other things, like how do you protect yourself and how do you even think about it in terms of your liability? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the key thing to look for in the vendors, first and foremost, is sort of how they're using your data. You want to know whether the data that you input and the outputs that you received, are they being used to sort of further train their models? And if so, are there opportunities to opt out of that? Many companies, even if they have that by default, you can, by sending an email or selecting a toggle in settings, can opt out of that. And so that's a really important thing to both review sort of your in-app, settings as well as your contract language. And then, yeah, I think, you could take some solace as the user of one of these tools that it's, much less likely that that you will be, that a claim would be brought against you as the user of a tool, so long as there's always the bigger, deeper pockets out there of, the Microsofts and OpenAIs and Googles and Metas of the world to be approached. But it isn't without risk. And I think one of the, the ways in which we look to mitigate that risk in a contract would be to seek an indemnity for third-party infringement claims. So if you get sued, you'd ideally want to be able to turn around to that vendor and say, look, I'm being sued because I used your tool that I paid you for, and now, I want you to basically make me whole. And that's, easier said than done sometimes, but, and there are importantly, limits on how, on the dollar value or the extent to which that recompensation might occur, but that would be the primary vehicle for seeking that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think read the contract, read the terms of service, because that's where all these vendors describe what your risks and liability and rights in things like the output and the model, etc. are. So just pay attention. And if you have leverage, to Justin's point, you can try to negotiate some contractual comfort.
And to close off this last question I see here around are law firms using, incorporating these technologies into our delivery of legal services, will it impact the legal industry? The answer is yes and yes. We are examining them closely. There's some really interesting technologies out there that are doing, this in a much more informative, much more sophisticated way than, than some, say, ChatGPT does, where it can sometimes make up case sites. And in doing, one of the ways that they do that is by actually this prompt engineering and taking lots of really rich data that contain the answers and plugging that in along with your legal query. But there are lots of different ways we're looking to make that as efficient as possible, and testing some of these different tools out.
All right, well, we are 3 minutes over, so I guess we got close. We packed a lot in an hour. Thank you so much, Justin and Scott. You guys are, at the forefront of all of this at a national level, and so we are just thrilled to be able to have you guys share some of your insights to our ecosystem here in Texas. And for those of you who don't know about our resources on our website, s3ventures.com, I highly recommend you guys go there. You can get the recording for this, as well as a bunch of other great tools and things that will hopefully help you on your startup journey. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye.